People will refer to a corporation sometimes as a private constitution. And there are a lot of important parallels between a corporation and a country. In both cases, there is a binding central document which will set forth the rules of the game. And in the case of America, of course, we have the Constitution as the foremost law of the land. The highest law of the land is the Constitution. Can anyone tell me what is equivalent to the Constitution in the case of a corporation? Joe.
Articles of Incorporation?
The Articles of Incorporation, or in Delaware, the Certificate of Incorporation, is the document which is the highest law within the corporation. The Articles of Incorporation, or the Certificate of Incorporation, can be understood as something similar to the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States will set forth the powers of Congress, the powers of the judiciary, the checks and the balances. Likewise, the Articles of Incorporation, or in Delaware, the Certificate of Incorporation, will set forth when shareholders have the right to vote, when they have the right to vote as a class or separately, whether the directors are indemnified or they have liability for their actions, and other fundamental aspects of how that corporation functions. Whether a majority or a supermajority is required to make fundamental changes, how many shares of stock that corporation can issue. And so each corporation is sort of a little mini experiment in governance. And one of the topics you'll learn about through this course is called corporate governance, how a corporation is run. Now, there are some standard aspects on corporations, and one of those is that we'll go through sort of the common elements of corporations in just a minute, but I want to step back. I should have stepped back. Why are we even talking about corporations? There are many business entities. This course could be called business associations. There are other business associations. There are partnerships. There are limited liability companies. There are limited liability limited partnerships. There are L3Cs. There are all sorts of funky things. Why are corporations important enough to be talking about? Well, as we'll see from our study of the news today, the most wealthy and influential organizations in America and around the world are corporations. It is the corporate form that predominates the conversation about business in America. There are many, many small firms, but just like each of us as an individual doesn't have the ability to necessarily influence politics or change national opinion or spend $1 billion on an ad campaign or develop a new product, it's really corporations that have that. And there are about 3,600, a little more, publicly traded corporations, some of which are worth over $1 trillion. So Apple, Amazon, both have a value of more than $1 trillion. So these corporations are more influential than many countries, just by sheer amount of wealth and influence that you can do with that wealth. They have, many of these companies employ more people than reside in certain nations, and as a result, they have an incredible influence on society. We don't find that with limited liability companies. We don't find that with partnerships. Of course, those are important, and if you take my other courses, we'll learn about them. They're important for startups, they're important for law firms, they're important for our society as well, but it is corporations that allow this massive concentration of wealth to persist over time in a sustainable way. And so to understand why corporations have become that form, we're going to look today a little bit about what makes a corporation different from other entities and how they came to be. So a corporation can be understood in a number of different ways. And I invite you to think about corporations through these different lenses as we go through the course. The first is the simple legal entity, right? Or maybe not so simple, but it's a simple concept that when you create a corporation, you create a new legal entity. So does everyone here have a social security number? Did you know that corporations do too? It's not called a SSN, it's called an EIN, an employer identification number. When you form a corporation, just like when you have a child, you register that corporation, and that corporation becomes an entity from the perspective of the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. It has an existence separate from you, just like your child, when it's born, has an existence separate from you. It can own property. it can enter into contracts. And in fact, it can make political contributions, maybe make political speech, outside of the influence of any one person. When I say one person, I mean that corporations are usually run by a team of people. Corporations are rarely, at least not these major ones that we're talking about. Of course, they can be. You could have a one-person corporation, but the intention of the form is to organize people into teams. And usually we do this with some specialization. There are folks that are the money, the capitalists, the investors. There are folks that are the labor. There are folks that are the management. And all these different people are going to contribute into this team. And so we can look at this team as a group of people working together to earn a return on their investment of their time, their investment of their money into this separate entity. They're giving their time and their energy and their ideas and their creative forces to this entity for the sake of a mutual profit interest. Others have described corporations more of a web of contracts than of an entity. An entity suggests that there's some kind of bounds to it. An entity sounds like, this is where I end and the table begins. But corporations are not so impermeable. Corporations have fuzzy boundaries. For example, has anyone here ever been a contractor, done any contract work, contract writing, contract nursing care, that sort of thing? Can you tell me about it, Sam?
Yeah, I was a contractor for Highmark for, I guess, a year, doing content for their social media channels.
So you were generating social media content. And so did you go to work in their building?
Sometimes, mostly it was work from home.
Sometimes work from home, sometimes in their building. Did you work with people who were employees?
Yeah.
And did you work with other independent contractors?
Yeah.
Yeah, worked with some employees, worked with some contractors. And were you paid?
Yes.
How were you paid? Were you paid with salary?
No, I was paid an hourly rate through like a third-party agency.
Through a third-party agency. All right, providing services. So was Sam part of Highmark, the entity? Okay, well, let's just change it a little bit. Let's say that he wasn't paid through a third party, but paid through Highmark directly. Now, is he part of Highmark? Let's say that he was termed an employee and still paid hourly. He was doing the same job, the same work, same working at home. He got a couple additional benefits. Is he now part of Highmark? What if he was an employee for 3 days as opposed to 1 year? Is he more a part of Highmark as an employee for 3 days than a contractor for 1 year? Has anyone worked as a contractor for longer than that? John, how long were you a contractor for?
I mean, I've had consulting contracts with different healthcare systems. Some of them last on the order of months, some of them go into years.
These years. So, as you work with a company for years, did you become part of their team? Did you feel like a part of their team?
You become an entity on their team, but there's still a distinguishment that you're not part of their corporate structure.
Right. Yeah, but maybe there's some kind of fuzzy boundaries. There's your inner circle and your super inner circle and your contractors and your more and less important contractors. And someone you pay to sub for a day and some you have and you work with for a year. Anyway, the concept of the web of contracts is that the entity is a little fuzzier. And we're not going to draw a sharp boundary and say, you're in, you're out, this is the entity, this isn't. But the organization can ebb and flow through its contractual relationships. And basically, it's just a group of relationships that we refer to as Highmark. Highmark is the relationships that it has with employees, with contractors, with suppliers, with service providers, with customers. Importantly, it's an investment vehicle. It's a way to earn money. You can go on E-Trade and put money in Microsoft. And if they do their job right, that stock will be worth more later on. You could put it in GE and receive dividends. They may pay dividends if they sell enough washing machines. You get part of those profits. And it's interesting to think of them as a drama, and that's a lot of what this first session is, as we talk about the drama of the corporation, which is unfolding before us in Papa John's, in Nike, in Dick's Sporting Goods, and all of these examples where we have all these different players. They all have their own separate interests. They're all humans running around creating this combination of humans, this entity, this team, this web, this investment vehicle. So all of those lenses are appropriate in different contexts. There are a couple characteristics, though, that are consistent across corporations. By the way, a person came to my office today, and they're having some trouble in their limited liability company. Okay, the aspect of the trouble doesn't matter, attorney-client privilege, yada yada, but they're having some issues with the way that they're not getting along with members in the company. And my response was, this is a weird way to have this set up. This company, this limited liability company, is set up in a weird way which would invite problems. Corporations, unlike limited liability companies, have very rigid structures. There are ways to set them up badly, but one of the reasons they're so popular is they have very consistent features. A limited liability company can be set up many, many, many different ways. One of the advantages of the corporation, it does have some clear aspects to it, in addition to all the rules that we'll learn. All right, so what are those aspects? Well, a corporation will always be a separate entity from people. And it's going to be taxed separately. It can have a flow-through election, which we'll get to, but it is seen as separate from the IRS. It is not, if Patrick has a lawn care company, he is not the company. He may own the company, right? Corporations have owners. They can't be ownerless, by the way. There are some interesting ideas floating around about ownerless corporations, blockchain companies that are run by syndicates. We're not quite there yet. You need at least one shareholder to have a for-profit corporation. Someone needs to get the residual. So it's owned, but it's separate. Just like I am not my coffee mug. I own my coffee mug, but it's not me. And as a result, it can be sued, it can hold contracts in its own right. It has perpetual existence. It does not die. And this is one of the biggest reasons people get upset about the concentration of wealth in corporations. They can maintain their wealth, their control, their power forever. And some of them have lasted a very long time. Shareholders in a corporation have limited liability. And what this means is that you can't lose more than you've invested. If you've bought $100 worth of Microsoft stock, you could end up with $0 if that stock goes to zero. In fact, if you own Theranos stock, you now have $0 of Theranos stock because Theranos dissolved and they're not going to have enough to pay their shareholders after they pay their debt holders. Get to that slide in a minute. So, what does limited liability do for you? Well, if a corporation gets sued and owes more than it has, it can't go into your pockets to reach for that money. With some very important exceptions, which we'll learn about next semester, called piercing the corporate veil. Piercing the corporate veil is the exception to shareholder limited liability. It's sort of an equitable doctrine. Now, as I mentioned, the difference between LLCs and corporations, LLCs can have a flat structure. Corporations always have a centralized management. And the power is located with the board of directors. The board of directors runs the company. You might think, who runs the company? The CEO, right? That's the face of the company. The CEO does often do the day-to-day running of the company, but only because the board has authorized him to do so. This is also, by the way, true of our government. It's the executive, the president, whose job is to run the company, the country. You see the analogy, right? It's the job of the president to run the country, but he doesn't do everything. We have agencies that do a lot of this work, and they're called executive agencies, these regulatory bodies. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which is going to deal with stocks, the Federal Trade Commission. These executive agencies, the president will appoint their head, and they will run it. Similarly, the board of the corporation is going to appoint the CEO for the purpose of running the company, but he serves at the pleasure of the board. The power is with the board. They have the centralized management, and it's a very hierarchical structure. And finally, transferability of ownership means that you can sell your shares, and that's important because shareholders have limited rights. As we'll learn, they have 3 rights. They can vote for new directors and change the power, just like if we don't like the president, what can we do? Vote for new president. Every 4 years. Corporations, typically it's every year. Sometimes it's staggered. You vote for kind of like the Senate over 3 years can replace the entire board. Now, it's difficult, as you may have noticed, to replace the entire Senate, right? You may not like the Senate. It doesn't mean you're going to be able to replace them. It's one of the reasons that they're staggered. It makes it hard to replace because it takes 6 years to get through the whole cycle. And likewise, when you have a corporate board, it can be very difficult and time-consuming and expensive to replace that board. But that's what the Papa John's CEO seems to be trying to do right now. It's called a proxy battle, is he's soliciting support. And just like if you don't like the president, you can turn to your colleague and say, vote for someone else. Right? You have that ability to do that. You don't like the president, you go on Facebook and it's election time and you say, I don't like the Republicans, vote Democrat. I don't like the Democrats, vote Republican. I don't like anybody, vote independent. You can say that. You can solicit other people's vote. You can go door to door. You can canvass. Likewise, with the corporation, you don't like the directors. I'm a shareholder. Adam's a shareholder with some limitations, which are probably beyond the scope of this course. But if I'm a small shareholder, Adam's a small shareholder, I can call Adam and say, these directors are a bunch of no good nicks. Let's elect a different director. Let's elect me, right? And that's that proxy contest. Why is it called a proxy contest? Because unlike in an election where you have to show up in person to elect a corporate board, you don't have to show up. The meetings are usually in Cabo Cabo or somewhere lovely but rather expensive. And my private jet is low on gas right now, so I'm just not going to make it to Cabo. So instead, you vote by proxy. You authorize someone to vote on your behalf. And so it's called a proxy battle to replace management because I will say, hey, Kristen, hey, Adam, hey, Mallory, here's the blue card. Send it back so we authorize the agent to vote new set of directors. And that way I can vote them out. I can also sue. The second power that shareholders have is to sue the directors. And we'll learn about those director liabilities in second semester. They have a duty of care and a duty of loyalty and probably a duty of oversight, which may be part of the duty of loyalty, but the duty of care, fine. We'll deal with all that next term. Duties of directors, they violate them, they're liable for suit with some important caveats. Actually, the caveats are really important. It's really, really hard to sue directors also. And in fact, in most cases, the way that it's structured is the corporation will pay for the lawsuit against the director because the director will be indemnified or insured. And as a result, the shareholders end up basically suing themselves. And so suing is not so good. So how do you get out of a bad situation? Well, you sell your shares. I think the company's going down. The share's worth $100. I can go on E-Trade. I can get rid of my shares. Well, that works unless it doesn't. I mean, there's a couple problems with selling also. For example, if you're unhappy that the CEO of Papa John's, where you bought the shares at 100, has been saying some outrageous things, and now the shares are at 80, you've lost $20. You can still sell, but you're $20 worse off. Maybe what you want to do is have those shares get back up somehow. Maybe you want to hold on and replace him. But you can sell those shares, except when you can't. And we'll learn about close corporations where there are transfer restrictions. And that's the world that I primarily practice in, where you have a close company where the shares don't have an immediate resale. But all the companies we're going to talk about today are publicly traded, very easy, what we call liquid, easy to sell their shares. So there is transferability of ownership. It's just a question of whether there's a market for it. And so some of these smaller companies, you know, if Patrick starts a lawn care company, it might be harder for him to sell those shares than it would be for Microsoft if you buy some shares in Microsoft. If you want to sell your shares in Microsoft, several million are bought and sold every day. On the other hand, you want to sell shares in your own lawn care company, could take 6 months. Right? It's still transferable, but there's a difference in what we call liquidity. So those are the essential characteristics, and they are that last issue of transferability goes to whether the corporation is public, private, close, and we'll talk briefly about nonprofit. So what's the difference here? A public company, in the way that I use the term in this class, is one that is listed on a stock market. A public company is listed on a stock market and typically is going to be listed on one of two stock markets. What are the two major stock markets in America? Paul? New York Stock Exchange. and the other one. Chicago Mercantile Exchange sells like pork bellies and things, and that is the most significant futures exchange, but it doesn't sell stock. Yeah.
NASDAQ?
And the NASDAQ, the National Association of Security Dealers. Anyone know what NASDAQ stands for? National Association of Security Dealers and annotated quotations. It's the system. So the New York Stock Exchange is pretty old. I think it was established in 1789. There was a famous story about something called the Buttonwood Agreement, where a bunch of guys met under a tree and essentially agreed to collude. This was before the antitrust laws, but essentially it was an agreement to collude and to sell only to each other. And it was one of the original conspiracies, as though the original wealthy Anglo-Saxon Protestant white males got together in order to increase their wealth. It's basically the origins of the stock market, and we're not too surprised. And it persisted for a very long time. There was a number of regional stock markets for a while. The Boston and the Philadelphia stock market were a close second and third for a while. But for reasons that will become, I would say, the New York Stock Exchange became the number one stock exchange because of a very important invention. What invention made the New York Stock Exchange? The ticker tape and the telegraph. What is a ticker tape and a telegraph? So when you had regional stock markets, you had to actually go to the market to get information. And so it made sense because it was very hard to travel in 1789. You didn't go very far very fast with your horse and cart. And so information traveled slowly. Regional markets were important because it would take days to get from Washington, D.C. to Boston. And so if you had a company on the Boston Stock Exchange and you were in South Carolina for that matter, you wouldn't have very prompt information, hard to buy and sell. So regional stock markets persisted. But the ticker, and which was a part of the telegraph. So the telegraph system sends electronic signals over a wire. Dashes and dots. Beep, 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 SOS, that sort of thing. A guy invented technology that would turn that into words on a tape, kind of like a fax machine. Really, it's basically a very early fax machine. It would spit out this information. It would tell you the name of a stock and its current value. And you could place an order over the telephone or telegraph, I think it was mostly telegraph at that time, to actually buy and sell that stock from anywhere. And these transmissions traveled incredibly fast and were very efficient, although there was really a period of time there's a lot of fraud around this. But basically, for a long time after the ticker tape, since there was no need for multiple regional exchanges, one would emerge as the top exchange, and it was New York. And Wall Street really became cemented as the center of American commerce and has really stood for American commerce. However, in the 70s, NASDAQ entered the market, and they had an incredible innovation. Does anyone know what NASDAQ's incredible innovation was? Why did NASDAQ have a competitive advantage versus the New York Stock Exchange? Why did they need a second stock exchange? It offered electronic delivery of stock information. So just like the ticker tape is what made the New York Stock Exchange, in my opinion, the stock exchange, the ability to transmit this information electronically, digitally, and the other invention was decimals. Yes, decimals. Under the New York Stock Exchange, I don't remember if it was 1/8 or 1/16 of a dollar was the smallest denomination for a trade. And so you couldn't buy and sell a share of stock for a penny. The concept of penny shares did not exist until NASDAQ came out with new technology that got us down to a decimal. And so now we have two types of stock markets. NASDAQ has traditionally been more tech stock focused, and New York Stock Exchange has typically been more blue chip, which are referred to as sort of your large, older corporations, your GEs of the world. There's one more thing that the NASDAQ offers that the New York Stock Exchange does not. Anyone in marketing? What marketing advantage is there to being listed on the New York Stock Exchange? Sorry. What marketing advantage is there to be listed on the NASDAQ as opposed to the New York Stock Exchange? What is the symbol? What is the stock symbol for AT&T? ATT. What's the stock symbol for Papa John's? PZZA. 3 letters, 4 letters. You can spell a lot more words and have a lot more of a marketing influence with 4 letters than 3. And so the other advantage, when you see a 4-letter symbol, you're looking at a stock that's on the NASDAQ. When you see a 3-letter symbol, you're looking at something on the New York Stock Exchange. Yeah.
Are they only on one?
Usually companies are listed on just one exchange. It's not impossible to cross-list, but you have to comply with requirements and expenses of both, and so I don't think there are many companies that do it. It is possible, I'm aware that there are some that do, but it would be expensive, and it's a real question of whether it gets you any additional value. Most people that have access to one would have access to the other, and it's very expensive to be listed on both. Yeah. If you are listed on both, that would be called cross-listed. By the way, there are a number of other stock exchanges in America, and all these companies are public in that sense. There still is a Philadelphia Stock Exchange. There's even some really crappy Canadian stock exchanges that, that have very, very minimal listing requirements. And I say crappy with it in a technical sense. I mean, like crummy companies that you wouldn't really want to invest in very badly. Go there because it's cheaper. And their stock prices are lower. There's a market for that too. There's actually a market for stock exchanges. There are better and worse stock exchanges. There have been experiments with venture exchanges, new exchanges. And so there are a number of these exchanges. Anyone who's listed on a stock exchange of any sort is a public company. But when you hear me talk about it, what I'm really thinking of are those big companies on the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. Then we have our private companies. Private companies are not listed, and there's a very good reason not to list. It costs at least $1 million to get listed. It costs, over a period of time, millions of dollars to stay listed, because you have to comply with a lot of requirements set forth by the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as requirements set forth by the exchange itself. The New York Stock Exchange has rules like you need to have a compensation committee and an audit committee, and you need to have such and such capital requirements, and you need to make certain reports and disclosures. I've done the reports and disclosures. They're really annoying, and they're really expensive, and you can get sued if you say something out of line. Elon Musk is probably going to get sued because he said his company would be better off private. Elon Musk said Tesla would be better off private. It's a public company. What happened? The stock price went up. Why did the stock price go up? Because typically when you take a company private, you do so by buying out the shares at a premium. So if the share is worth $100 today and you think it's going to be worth $120 tomorrow, should you buy or sell? Let me give that to you again. It's worth $100 today. It'll be worth $120 tomorrow. Do you buy or sell? You buy. You buy because the price is going up. You sell when the price is going down, right? So you buy the shares. What happened? He didn't have a deal. He didn't have a deal, and so the stock price ended up going down below where it started from. Was he allowed to say that? It's a good issue for your midterm. Hey, talking about taking it private, there would be a premium for that. Now, companies might want to stay private. Musk wants to stay private, wants to go private. Michael Dell took his company private. Anyone here have a Dell computer? Bought it from a private company, huge private company, massive private company. Why did he take it private? Why do companies go private? Because they don't have to make disclosures, they don't have to put up with lawsuits from shareholders nearly as much, they don't have to file with the SEC, et cetera, and that, I guess, begs the flip side question. Why would a company be public? What's the advantage of being public? Well, if you're public, you can raise money through the stock market. That's the big advantage. You go public, but in return, the government takes its pound of flesh, so to speak, right? You get the ability to raise money from the American people, but it's going to make sure that you don't defraud them. And sometimes, as we'll see, that can go overboard, result in additional lawsuits, expose liability, so companies are more and more choosing to stay private and go private. Now, a private company can be huge. Anyone here can name a huge private company? Koch Industries is huge. Although it is not a great example for me here, for the reason that it's owned by only a few people. But you're right, the Coke industry is huge. I was thinking of, for example, Uber. Why was I thinking of Uber, not Coke Industries? Because Uber has many, many, many stockholders. It has investment from venture capital. There are, I know that there's less than 1,500. I don't know how many it has. 1,500 is a threshold. But 1,500 is a lot of people. Let's say they have 1,400 shareholders. Right? Why? Because startup companies like Uber give stock to their employees instead of paying them salary. And so they end up with a lot of stockholders. And those stockholders, just like any stockholders, have rights. So Uber is an example of a private company, which is very large and has a lot of stockholders. When I talk about private companies, I'm usually referring to this type of startup, which is going to have, it's not traded on a stock exchange, but it has lots of stockholders. So what's the problem with a private company? Kelly, if you had stock in a private company, would you be happy or sad? How would you go about, let's say you have 100 shares of Uber stock from your work there, and let's say that Uber shares are worth $100 each. So $10,000 in stock value. How are you going to cash that in? Can you go online and sell Uber shares on E-Trade? No, you can't. That's the nature of it being private. It's not listed on a stock exchange. Let's say you had $10,000 of Microsoft shares. You know how to deal with that, right? You go to etrade.com, you go to your stock, you hit 100, sell, done. You got $10,000 in your bank account. But if you have 100 shares of Uber worth $100 each, you have nothing until you sell those shares. And in the meantime, lots of things can happen. You could need to buy a house. You could have a kid. You could get sick and need that money. The company could go to zero because Colin Kaepernick, the CEO of Uber, forget his name, whatever. Trevor Kalanick. Colin Kaepernick come later. Trevor Kalanick, right? You run the company badly, tank the stock price, cause a lot of damage. You would be stuck with that until you could get rid of those shares. Now, there are people that will buy Uber shares, but because they are one of a few type of people that can buy those shares, they'll take about a discount. So if you had 100 shares of Uber worth $100 each, in fact, if I gave any of you a choice, would you like to have 100 shares of Uber at $100 each, or 100 shares of Microsoft at $100 each? It's not apples for apples. Why not? Well, Uber could move a lot. They could go public. There could be a big bump. But in the meantime, you either have to hold those shares or sell them at a deep discount, like a 60% discount. Maybe those shares are worth $4,000 today on the open market. Those are a long-term buy and hold strategy. You have shares in Microsoft. Well, it probably won't go up 10 times, but you can sell them tomorrow if you need the money. Now, there's also closed companies. Now, closed companies can be small or large in terms of market cap, but closed means there are very few shareholders. And there's definitely not a market for these shares. There aren't entities that go around buying this sort of stock in general. And the guys aren't selling it. I mean, we talk about the Koch brothers, and they own a large corporation, but it's the brothers, right? It's not just like anyone can get in on that investment. It's their company. And closed corporations have special rules that we'll learn a little bit about as we go along, although this is, of course, mostly about public companies. Yeah, Kelly.
I'm sorry, so who would I sell my Uber shares to?
So there are marketplaces for the sale of those shares, and I'm going to get a little technical, but there are something called 144A resale markets, and you have to get certain accreditations to be a purchaser of these shares. You have to be a very high net worth individual or entity. And they will advertise, and there was a business called Second Market that operated a marketplace for the sale of these shares. They got shut down by the SEC, and now it's not clear. You kind of have to do it without soliciting, and what you have to do is you have to basically know a very wealthy individual who has this special accreditation by virtue of their brokerage licensing and or a high net worth. At least $5 million, I think. In fact, I think you have to talk to a qualified institutional buyer, which means $100 million in assets.
And then what would their benefit be, hoping that it would?
Well, they have $100 million in assets, and you need cash now, right? So they're willing to buy your shares for 40 cents on the dollar and hold on to them because it don't take much for that to go, that to be profitable. And they can hold Uber for 10 more years. And more than that, they might make a deliberate strategy to go to all the employees of Uber, buy out many of their shares, and then exert influence the same way a public company shareholder who owned a lot of shares would. And they can start making pressure on the Uber board, making demands, maybe getting a board seat, etc. Because they're powerful enough that they could potentially buy up some of those stocks and exert some influence. It's usually better to have a lot of stock in a company than a little because you get more control. And so you get a little bit more on the voting side of things. You have more influence. Yeah. Follow?
Sorry, and what was that third right that the shareholders have? You can vote for new directors, you can sue the directors, and what was the third?
Sell.
Sell.
And you can sell. And you can sell the shares. Vote, sue, sell. 3 rights of shareholders. Joanne? Joanne.
I'm just not understanding, why would they give the employees the shares? It's not helping them raise money. I don't understand.
Sure. So, you're a programmer. Anyone here a programmer? If you were, why would you be here, right? You could be making $200,000 in Silicon Valley. So there's a couple issues here. Okay, first off, I'll talk about it theoretically. The question, by the way, again, why give shares to employees? I'll talk about that from the company perspective, and I'll talk about that from the employee perspective. From the company perspective, what is the difference between shares and cash? Shares don't cost you anything, and cash does. There's an expression, anyone heard it? Cash is king. What can you do with cash? You can pay rent. You can buy supplies. You can get advertising. You can hire someone else who won't work for stock. Startups especially, but many businesses find cash hard to come by. And if you can get what you need without paying cash for it, great. Now you don't want to dilute out your investment base too much, but effectively we're minting these shares. We're diluting the value to everyone else, but so what? We don't have the cash to pay you. Here's something else in return. Now, what about, that's the finance perspective, agency cost. If you're an employee, what do you want? You want to get paid. If you're an employer, what do you want? Someone to work hard. If you're an employee, do you want to work as hard as you can? No, you want to work as little as you can and get paid as much as you can. If you're an employer, do you want to pay as much as you can? No, you want to pay as little as you can and get as much work as you can. Can you see the imbalance here? Employee wants to get paid and not work. Employer wants to not pay and get work. So we have a misalignment of incentives, and this creates an incentive in the employee to shirk, right, to do their job poorly. So how do we encourage this person to work harder? Well, give them a piece of the reward for the whole thing. If the company becomes a billion-dollar company and Kelly has 100 shares, let's say the company is worth $1 million and you're employee number 10. You get 100 shares, and the company becomes a billion-dollar company. Right? That's 100 times more. Sorry, it's 1,000 times more. 1,000 times more. So your $100 worth of shares are now worth 1,000 times more as well. So are you encouraged to work hard? I mean, if you sleep at your desk and you're not paying attention to your emails and the company misses a sale, that hurts you where it counts, in the wallet. Right? And so you're encouraged to get that stock price to go up to do what's right by the company. So it encouraged an alignment of incentives. From the employee perspective, why would you want stock instead of cash? Well, it depends who you are. Depends a lot on your gender. Depends on your age. Depends on where you are in your life. Generally, the people that make these choices are young males. Why? Young males can afford to take risks that older males and women who are looking to start families or support them are not always able to make. So there is some distinction in what kind of risk appetite you have based on your status in life. Of course, it's not a rule across the board, but in general, you look at who's taking these jobs. It's 21-year-old guys who are willing to take a flyer. They don't care if they get paid a fourth of what they might make for the next 5 years. They have a chance at making it big. And this is why you get invested in these companies anyway. But not everyone wants to take that job. I don't want to take that job. I'm happy with a paycheck. I'm not at that point in my life. I'm not a 21-year-old coder. I'm not looking to make 1,000 times or nothing. I'm looking to pay my mortgage. And some of you may be in that place too. Some of you may be at a point in your life where you're saying, it doesn't matter. I've got my nest egg. I'm set, and I'm ready to take a flyer on this. And if I work for 5 years and get nothing from it, fine. But I have a chance at making $5 million, and that's worth it. Others of you might say, geez, if I don't bring a paycheck home every single week, my house is going to get repossessed, I can't pay for my kids' school, my wife isn't going to be able to, can't pay the lease, or whatever it is, right? And so a person's incentives to take on this kind of position, you got to put yourself in different people's mindsets. So not every employee is going to want this, but some people want a chance at becoming a millionaire, and it's worth foregoing a salary now. And so you attract a certain type of person, which happens to be the type of person these corporations generally want. Although, as I've talked about in some of my CLEs, it also produces a certain kind of culture, because when you have a lot of risk-taking 21-year-old men running an organization, they do some pretty risky and stupid stuff. So just background. Yeah, Lydia.
So is there usually a nominal payment, some?
Yes, there's minimum wage. I mean, always. Always, 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 right? Minimum wage laws apply. And yes, there's usually some mix of compensation. But you see this mostly with CEOs and people that have the ability to really change the company. In America, CEOs are paid more than half in stock options. Usually much more than half. Can be 80%. Some CEOs take home $1 a year and get compensated in stock. Or like an ostensible dollar. Yeah.
I'm not trying to be obtuse, but if they can't sell them to such a limited group of people, how will they ever cash in on them?
Well, they're hoping that the company will go public eventually. Right? I mean, the Uber employees are still waiting for Uber to go public so they can get a piece of that action. The Facebook employees were delighted. That's how Sheryl Sandberg became a billionaire. She wasn't a billionaire. Facebook went public. She was a billionaire. Right? And so that's what people are waiting for. And that should really emphasize the risk here. Because Uber hasn't gone public, and they may never go public. Not before they dissolve, or who knows what will happen to them. You might have worked for Uber for the last 14 years at a salary a third of what you could got at IBM and end up with nothing. Or you could be the next Sheryl Sandberg. Do you want to take that risk? Some people would, some people wouldn't. It might depend on your obligations. It might depend if you're supporting an elderly family member. It might depend on whether or not you have a trust fund. Right? Different people are going to have different risk preferences and take that job because it's worth it to them. Yeah.
I think, isn't it true there's quite a motivation for the corporation to pay its stock option, because I think the IRS actually penalizes you over a certain amount of salary to like CEOs, for example.
So
$1 million or something.
there's always someone who wants to talk about tax. So no, I mean, I'm being only a little facetious. I do teach a little bit about this. There are actually two different kinds of stock options, ISOs and NQSOs. ISOs are much more tax favorable, but often don't have the positive result that you'd expect from them. So there's some real complexity with tax law and granting options. There's also obviously a lot of complexity with corporate tax. Isn't a class I can get into that with any real detail. Yes, there are some issues with how the IRS taxes salaries. Yes, as a result, companies are encouraged to hire independent contractors as opposed to employees and to compensate in other means as opposed to salary, but that's a bigger conversation. I think more predominantly than the tax issue is going to be incentivizing people and aligning the risk profile of the employee with the position. And as I think I pointed out, you're going to really see some discrepancies among people's risk profiles to take on and spend 14 years waiting for the paycheck or cash out, and that's the thing, like life changes, you go into this and you think the company's going public in 5 years, and 14 years later you're still in Uber, still trying to afford rent in Menlo Park, still not able to buy your first home, and you might say to yourself, geez, I've got 2 kids, I still don't own my own home, I've been at Facebook for 14 years, this stock could go to zero, maybe I should sell it for 40 cents on the dollar. Right? So I've argued in other places that the lack of resale markets for these type of securities hurts employees, especially vulnerable employees. But that's a little bit aside the point. Okay, types of corporations then. We have public, which are going to be traded on the NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, could be other exchanges. Private companies like Uber that are often going to grant stock options have a large body of shareholders, but those shareholders will have a difficult time selling their shares. They're hoping the company goes public one day, or that these resale markets emerge or become more robust so Kelly can get more than 40 cents on the dollar. You have your closed companies, which are going to be tightly held, special rules pertaining to them, fewer issues with shareholders, but of course limited or no access to capital by giving away your stock. And finally, nonprofits. This is not a course in nonprofits. I only mention them tangentially. Nonprofits don't have shareholders. So that's a fundamental difference. There is no shareholder of a nonprofit. They're not supposed to get profits. What are shareholders entitled to? Residual profits. How many residual profits does a company have that doesn't have profits? I'm being a little ridiculous. None, obviously. So nonprofits don't have shareholders. Now, we're dealing with a course on shareholder rights and duties to shareholders, so nonprofits are not part of this course. I won't ask you any questions about nonprofits. Happy to talk about them in general, and I do some work on nonprofit boards and board governance, some interesting topics there, but okay. So like I said, we have the Constitution of the United States, the highest law of the land. The states have their own bodies of law also. States can enact statutes, and the corporate law is a creature of state statute. And so if you look to the Delaware Corporate Code, you can find some rules that will govern corporations. It authorizes the creation of the articles or the certificate of incorporation, which is the highest law within that new entity, that corporation that was formed. And in addition, the corporation will have something called bylaws, which are more extensive than the certificate of incorporation. A big difference in the articles or the certificate of incorporation, the bylaws, the articles or certificate of incorporation is filed publicly with the Secretary of State of this of whatever state, Delaware, California, Pennsylvania. The bylaws are not filed. They're therefore easier to amend. All right. So that's your corporate structure there. So we've got our shareholders. There are two categories of shareholders in general: preferred shareholders that have some special rights that make them look a little bit more like debt holders. We'll get into that in our module on capital structure, what the difference is there. That's your online learning module that you'll be completing. I think it's next week on capital structure. Is it 2 weeks? Yeah. 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks. 2 weeks for the online learning module on capital structure. You'll find that common stockholders have very few rights. They're entitled to the residual. They can vote, sue, sell, but don't have special rights. Preferred have some special rights and are entitled to something called dividends, which seems a lot like interest, which is something debt holders are entitled to. And they're paid in that reverse order. So we've also then have the shareholders will then appoint or vote for the directors. Directors can be inside or outside. Inside simply means the director is also an employee. Outside is a director who's not an employee of the company. So inside directors are employees of the company. Outside directors are not. And then we have officers who are not directors. This is the CEO. This is the CFO, the secretary, the president. These sort of titles are employees. They are highest level management, upper management, but they are employees of the company and sometimes participate on the board. So that's what a board looks like. GE was very proud of their board, with all these nice smiling people here, so they posted that lovely picture. Boards have become more diverse in recent years. There's been a lot of pressure on boards to become more diverse. As recently as a couple years ago, you had some real issues with boards being 90% white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males who are age 67 and played at the same country club in New Haven. But, that has been changing a bit, which academics certainly think, but the market thinks, I think, as well, that this is a positive because diversity adds ideas, adds better management. You get into, just like you see on social media, you can get into an echo chamber when you're only hearing from your friends. So there's clearly been a push to diversify boards. It seems to be succeeding, both in terms of having more diverse company board representation and those boards being more effective. So that's really good to see. But this is another issue that you can deal with when dealing with corporations and society, is that they tend to be really skewed. I'm being facetious, but not that facetious, that it's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, age 67, with salt and pepper hair, about 6'1", that play golf in the same country club in New Haven. That's generally the prototype. And then you kind of expand out from there. Yeah.
Where do the outside directors come? Is it just people that?
Other corporations. They'll usually be industry experts. So the question is, where do outside directors come from? Why are they hired? The company wants to get expertise from people. Also, board directors have less obligations than the CEO. So an individual might be a wealthy, often older individual with lots of experience in industry, and they might sit on several boards and have obligations to attend board meetings monthly or quarterly, but clearly less responsibility than being a CEO. And they still get compensated for that, by the way. Sometimes board members can get compensated quite a lot. But the folks you see here in this picture, these lovely smiling people, they don't show up to work every day. They don't work 9 to 9 or 9 to 5 or 9 to 4 or 9 to 2. They come in for meetings periodically. They might run other companies. They might be private investors. They might be retired people. They might be professional directors. One thing to point out, what is missing from this picture? These are all human beings. It actually is a law that only human beings can be board directors. And you may not have thought about this, but it turns out to not really have a basis in anything. And one of my favorite faculty members, Todd Henderson at the University of Chicago, wrote a great paper called Boards Are Us, challenging the idea, why not have boards run by corporations? Why not? So it's an interesting article. You should take a read. I'm also working on a project suggesting that boards could be run by blockchains as opposed to human beings and have a kind of a complex voting mechanism. Not currently legal under Delaware law, but interesting thought experiment. Dan?
What is that? What's a blockchain?
Oh. I don't know if I actually have time for that, but a blockchain, okay, a very brief, let's see, I'll do blockchain in 23 seconds. So a blockchain is a decentralized database for storing information that uses consensus to determine what information is accurate on a multinodal chain that persists in many computers over time. It's an algorithm about how it's the data set. More fundamentally, the blockchain is the data set. There's an algorithm that will tell the operators of the data set which information to accept as true and verify it, and which information to reject. There is an algorithm to it, but once that information has been accepted by a large number of people on the network through a process called consensus and verifiable through a process called hashing, which is a type of encryption, a reverse encryption. There's other types as well. That information then is persistent on computers across the network, and it's that data that remains. It's transparent, and you can tell, you can do things with it, like you can tell who made a vote. You could use it for, basically, the reason it matters for corporate governance is you can use it for voting. How to use it for voting? You have this digital signature, and you can essentially spend your vote in a way which can't be double counted and can't be defrauded, and can be registered in milliseconds with the right technology. So ostensibly, if you had a corporation, you could use blockchain technology to have the shareholders directly control the company without a board, if they were so inclined, using this sort of consensus voting. And others have been writing about, similar again, the analogy, corporations and the Constitution, that blockchain could also be used for voting in the civic space. And I think Mary Beth has done some research and some work on that if you're interested in learning more from her. In addition to our shareholders, we have a broader group of people that are invested in the company called stakeholders. This includes your creditors, people that you owe money to, your employees, people that work for you, your suppliers, people that are going to provide the raw materials, your inputs, customers, those who are purchasing your outputs, and the community that you live in. The community is pretty important. I mean, Apple just built a new headquarters. They're a $1 trillion company. They just built a new headquarters. It's supposed to house 80,000 workers in this giant spaceship-looking glass thing. It's pretty cool looking, actually. And it's in Cupertino, a formerly sleepy town that can't handle the infrastructure at all. So now this small town of Cupertino has unbelievable LA-style traffic. So they have a responsibility to the community to kind of work through this, right? Or at least they're perceived to have some responsibility to the community. So those are all going to be members of the corporation that matter. All right, reminder then. So what are the rights of shareholders? Shareholders have 3 fundamental rights. They can vote, sue, and sell. And we'll come back to these throughout the course. This is going to be a central trope throughout the course as we understand when shareholders have these rights, right? What do they use the voting right to do? To get rid of the directors. It's the only thing, basically, I shouldn't say the only thing. There are some footnotes to everything I say. In general, the only thing shareholders vote for is to get rid of management. Shareholders will get rid of the board will change corporate policy, often firing the CEO. They can sue, but as I will see, they often end up suing themselves, and they can sell their shares. So let's take a look at what looks like a potential lawsuit. So there's a corporation, real corporation, during World War II. And during World War II, there's a big effort to entertain the troops. And so a corporation that seemed to have a lot of money, a lot of business, decided to sponsor a $1 million variety program in support of the troops, right? So not getting paid for this, although, by the way, why would a corporation put on a variety show for veterans, for troops, not veterans, active military? Joe.
Corporate goodwill sort of puts a good image. It's a good image for them.
Good image, right? I mean, it's a good image. You know what? Also, I mean, I'll be a little facetious here, but Philip Morris did a really nice solid to our troops in World War II by giving out cigarettes. Free cigarettes to the boys in the Army, right? What a nice thing that they did. Just so generous that they got our soldiers addicted to nicotine. I mean, gave them free cigarettes out of the goodness of their heart. So there can be a marketing angle to it as well. You get people hooked on the product. There can be some goodwill. And, you might even say they're just doing it out of patriotism. Maybe these other reasons. Anyway, there's a lot of reasons, and it's okay. Corporations can sponsor a variety show. As we'll learn, they have some responsibility not to waste money, but if they can say, well, it's going to get us customers, it's going to improve our goodwill, good, justified. One of the singers on the program is the wife of the company's the company board chair's wife. So the chairman of the board, he has a wife. The wife likes to sing. He says, well, you know, $100,000 contract, give it to the wife. Is that allowed? Let's talk about that. Shareholder is going to sue, say, hey, chairman of the board, you just spent $100,000 of corporate assets hiring your wife to sing for our troops. I'm not okay with that. Should that suit prevail? Well, what are some considerations? I mean, you don't know the law to this yet, but let's just talk about how this feels, right? Yeah. Whether you consider other people. Did you go through some process? Was she the best? That's a relevant question, right? Although, is anyone here married? Anyone here married? Jonathan. Okay. Are you happily married? Because I should always say happily. If you're not happily married, you might answer this question differently. But if you had what does your wife do?
She's a paralegal.
She's a paralegal. Okay, great. So you're familiar with the services, and you receive a stack of resumes for paralegal services. 10 resumes for paralegal services, and you go through and you see that one of them is your wife's. Is there any chance at all, even a little bit, would you maybe be a little biased toward her? Yeah. I mean, and first off, let's talk about this, right? If you're married to someone, your income is their income, so maybe you'd like it if they made $100,000 because you get to get a new yacht or whatever. It's World War II, so maybe that would buy you a yacht. Also, you probably like your wife and you think she's great, so maybe you have a little bit of bias that when you see her name on the paper and the credentials, whatever, and you're familiar with her, and you can make excuses for what she did, whatever. That's the nature of being invested with a person. In other words, that director, would they really be able to evaluate who is the best singer for that job? That's a real question. And in general, corporate law will say no. If you have a direct interest, if it's your wife that you're hiring, or your company that you're offering, or your building you're leasing to the firm, then you're interested. And if you're interested, you're probably conflicted out of that discussion. Now, is it wrong for the corporation to hire the singer? Probably not, provided that they go through some paper and process. If they just picked her, it looks like a boondoggle to help their buddy. And we'll see this case. Martha Stewart Living Omni Media, right? Martha Stewart has really made a comeback. I have some of her dish towels at this point. But she was sued for corporate fraud and a couple other things. Spent a little time in an orange jumpsuit. We'll get to Martha Stewart Living Omni Media in a bit. But her board was tasked with deciding whether or not to change her compensation and decided that they should provide her with that benefit. And even though the people that made the decision went to baby showers together and weddings and played golf and did all those things, it was found that they were sufficiently disinterested. So we'll learn about that as we go through. What is disinterested enough? But the person whose wife it is, they can't make the decision. But can the corporation? Yes, the corporation theoretically could, provided that it's approved with paper and process by disinterested directors. So that instinct was right on. But also the instinct that it's hard to be totally unbiased when it comes to your own personal interest, whether it's money that becomes joint income, whether it's an apartment you're trying to lease, and you want the corporation to do it. Joe.
So in a situation like that, someone on the board, would they easily be able to just say, hey, I'm out of this vote, I'm out of this decision, kind of temporarily off the board until that decision is made, and then they can jump back in, pretty much?
So we have a week on the topic, so I'll give you the short answer, which is that it is incumbent on the board, whether by that person recusing themselves or the rest of the board, or, this is when the lawyer in the room is supposed to say, John, you're going to have to step outside for this one, because it's your wife we're talking about here, right? That's the lawyer. Someone needs to say that, whether it's, and if it's serious enough, an independent committee has to be formed. And someone should make sure that the independent committee is formed properly And then someone has to make sure the independent committee is formed properly. That the independent committee, be watch your problem. At some point you get pretty attenuated with the agency costs. You figure this is good enough, this is 99.9%. There's a process for that. And it definitely involves the person who's conflicted, interested, to leave the room, not participate in the discussion, and hopefully not influence the others. The others have to remain disinterested in order for the vote to be valid. But it can be valid if it's done properly. So, answer that brief hypothetical. So that gets us to what are the major fiduciary duties. Some concepts. These will all come up again. Like I mentioned, these are all about the liabilities of directors, because directors have duties. When they fail to meet those duties, they can be liable for damages. And so we're going to frame that in the context of what we'll call the business judgment rule. And the business judgment rule says that directors are presumed to be acting honestly and unselfishly when they act with paper and process. So if I am the CEO and I decide that we should increase goodwill by putting on a $1 million variety show for our troops in Afghanistan, it's presumed as a baseline that I'm doing that with the corporation's best interests in mind. And so that's called the business judgment rule. And the business judgment rule is a presumption that directors, when they're acting for the corporation, are fulfilling their duty of care. And the duty of care says a director is called upon to use care, to exercise judgment, the degree of care, the kind of judgment that one would give in similar situations, the conduct of their own affairs. And there's a presumption that a director is doing that. What does that mean? That means when a director is acting on behalf of the company, when they're running the company, it's very hard to sue them, because when they're doing things for the company, when they're deciding to have the iPhone called the iPhone XS, which is stupid, by the way. We can all agree that that's a stupid name for the new iPhone. But that's a business decision. Okay, so you can't sue the director for approving iPhone XS, even though in hindsight it will turn out, and in foresight I'm putting a record on that one, it's going to turn out to be stupid. And but it's a business decision, right? Now, what's the flip side of that? However, when a person has a personal conflict, when you've decided to hire your wife, when you decide to lease your building back to the company, when you've decided to sell your iPad to the firm for $400,000, because that's what it's worth, look at it, it's gold, it's rose gold. When there's a personal interest that may tend to produce a conflict, there's a presumption against operating under business judgment. When Jonathan makes a decision to hire someone and his wife is one of the paralegals in that stack, there's a presumption against him. It has suddenly become very easy to sue Jonathan if he decides to hire his wife out of that stack of paralegals. The presumption is that if you have an interest, you're not acting with the corporation's best interest if you have your own interest. Now, like we talked about, and we'll talk about extensively, that can be cleansed. It can be cleansed by Jonathan saying, hey, other partners in my firm, I got to step out of this one. My wife's one of the candidates. Okay, so I'm going to recuse myself. That's fine so long as the rest of them are disinterested. Now, they may be interested also for a variety of reasons, like Martha Stewart's friends might have been, or as we'll see, some members of the Stanford faculty seem to have been interested in Oracle because Oracle funded their chair. Okay, but basic idea is that we don't generally find liability for directors when they're acting on the behalf of the corporation. However, we may when they also have a conflict of interest. In fact, we often will presume that they are not acting in the corporation's best interests when they have an interest of their own. How do we sue them? There are two main ways to sue them: direct suit and a class action. Sorry, I misspoke. Two ways to sue them: a derivative suit and a direct class action. So direct and derivative are two different ways to sue them. What do they look like? A derivative suit is where the shareholders will institute a suit on behalf of the corporation. They will force the corporation to sue the directors. As I mentioned, the shareholders have very limited rights: vote, sue, sell, although, footnote to everything, if there is a reasonable allegation that a director has violated the duty of loyalty or the duty of care, it's possible for a suit to be imposed by the shareholders through a process called a derivative suit, which basically is making a demand on the board for the board to sue itself. And they have to set up an independent committee to determine whether the suit should proceed. Because, Patrick, if I said, hey, Patrick, you should sue yourself. Right. Do I even have to ask? Anyone here, raise your hand if you like to sue yourself. Who here would have an interest in not suing yourself? Yes. The answer to yes. That was the easy one. Yes. No one here wants to sue themselves. And so directors are no different. They don't want to be embroiled in a lawsuit. And so generally directors will refuse. So they have to set up a SLC, a special litigation committee. The shareholders will demand the suit. They won't actually make a demand. The process is more complicated. I will get to it. But long story short, because directors won't sue themselves, they will form, in some cases they have to form a special litigation committee. By the way, the special litigation committee is usually formed of other board members, so there's some systemic bias. But whatever, it's the best we can do right now. So we have those derivative suits. We can also sue directly as a class action when the shareholders are harmed by virtue of being shareholders. And so we'll talk about that distinction because it's very important which litigation step you take. A derivative suit is when the shareholders sue the corporation or force the corporation to, a derivative suit is where the shareholders force the corporation to sue the directors because of the directors' harm to the corporation. A derivative suit is where the shareholders force the corporation to sue the directors because the directors harmed the corporation. A class action suit is where the shareholders form a group and they sue the directors because the directors harmed the shareholders. What is the difference between harm to the corporation and harm to the shareholders? An important distinction. We will spend a week dealing with that as well, selecting between the direct and the derivative litigation procedure. Spoiler alert, a harm to the corporation is something like the value of the corporation goes down, right? The stock price goes down. So what Papa John's CEO has done, did it harm the shareholders as shareholders? Well, no. Shareholders as shareholders only have 3 rights. Did it harm their right to vote? No, they can still vote. Did it harm their right to sue? No, they're going to sue, probably. Did it harm their right to sell? No, they can still sell, but they're selling something less valuable because the stock price went down. So, what are they suing on behalf of? They're suing on behalf of the corporation, which has lost value because of the actions of a fiduciary. Who can sue? This is a very general concept of corporate securities. The way that I've painted this picture is to show kind of the risk. Sometimes you see the comment on the bottom. I flip that in the next phase. But what I'm trying to get across in this first one is that there's a correlation between risk and return. So we talked about this a little bit. So why would a person work for Uber when it might be 14 years before they get their $5 million paycheck? Well, because it's a $5 million paycheck. Some people are willing to take that risk. Some people can afford to take that risk. Others can't afford to take that risk or don't want to take that risk. So if you want to take that high level of risk, you can have common stock in a company like this and hope that it goes public. You won't have any real rights in the meantime. You have to wait it out, but you might get a lot of money, whatever's left. We'll learn about preferred stockholders in the module on corporate finance. And preferred stockholders are usually wealthier investors who have put money into the company, who have bought that stock. And they do get certain rights and protections, including the right to be paid before the common shareholders. But if you really want to play it safe, you won't invest in the company. You'll make a loan to the company because loan holders get paid before shareholders. And why are loans less risky? Well, they're less risky for a number of reasons. How do loans work? Does anyone here have a student loan? Do you have to pay it yet? Maybe that doesn't count, actually. Does anyone have a car loan? Do you have to pay your car loan every month? Right. What happens if you don't pay your car loan every month? They will take your car away, right? You will go into default, they'll take your car away. Anyone have a home loan? Home loan. Do you have to pay your home loan every month? What happens if you don't pay your home loan? They will take your house away, so you better pay your home loan. And if a corporation doesn't pay its debt holders, doesn't pay its loan, they can foreclose the company, take its assets away. You don't have to pay your shareholders. So the debt holders get paid first. They can demand payment or force foreclosure if they're not paid, but they only get paid a percentage, a set percentage, and it's not 1,000%. I don't know what current usury laws are right now, but some of you might have credit cards that you pay 35% interest on. Now that sucks, okay? especially if it's a lot of money at 35% interest. That sucks, but that's not the type of money that people are trying to make by investing in Uber. They don't really want 35%. Even 35% a year is chump change when you have the prospect of investing $1 million and taking out $1 billion, right? A 1,000x return or a 100,000% return. 100,000%, 35%, totally different. You want to get that huge return, you take on a huge risk of maybe getting nothing. You want to have you're willing to settle with a smaller return, you get some assurances that you will get paid back on time. And how do you get paid back? Well, if the company liquidates, right, if it gets bought and is turned into cash, or if it sells all its assets, who gets paid first? The debt holders, they get paid first, then the preferred stockholders, and then the common stockholders in this liquidation payout. Now, that's the good story. Now, I don't know if you can tell, picture, but what I meant to show here is you got this waterfall, this beautiful lake. That's a lot of water in that lake, right? So what I'm trying to represent here is that after the debt holders have gotten paid up there, right, they've filled up, the waterfall has filled up what the debt holders are owed, and it spills over. And then next the preferred are paid until their cup is full, and everything that's left goes to the common shareholders. And that can be a lot of money. So, as a common shareholder, you do get paid last, but you get everything that's left. And the residual in a company like this could be huge. Of course, it could also be bupkis. Because by the time Theranos is done paying their debt holders, they're going to have nothing left. If you invested in Theranos, even as a preferred stockholder, you are SOL. And if you're a common stockholder who spent the last 10 years working for Theranos, making less of a salary than you could at Genentech, you are SOL. You are sorry, out of luck. You're not getting paid. So a little joke on that, are businessmen really risk takers? Well, they claim to be. Businessmen thrive on risk, taking bold chances. Why aren't you investing? Oh, too much uncertainty. Well, there's a correlation between uncertainty and reward. All right, a couple more concepts to go over, and then we'll do a little conversation about current events. So just a couple more things to talk about. We'll get back to this in capital structure. I just want to briefly introduce this. I mentioned shareholders. Shareholders get stock or shares. They're synonyms. Okay, some states use the term shares, stock, same thing. Shares of stock, same concept. It's a percentage interest in the company. There are different ways you talk about shares. The company, in its certificate of incorporation, that constitutional document, that foundational document, will authorize a certain number of shares that could be given out. It's kind of like the amount of money the mint can print, right? There's a certain, so a company might form and say, this company is allowed to distribute 1 million shares. Okay. Now, at the end of the day, it's a percentage, so we only care about the percentage, whether it's 1 million or 100 or what have you. But the first thing to understand is that we authorize shares, and so in order to authorize shares, as I mentioned, it's in that foundational document that gets filed with the Secretary of State, which has certain provisions that protect it from being changed. So it's hard to change your authorized shares. Why? Because you should care about your overall percentage that you have, and if they could simply print more money, print more shares, your percentage goes down. So the concept of authorized are the amount of shares the corporation is holding on to that it could theoretically distribute or issue. Shares that are actually given to employees or sold to investors are called issued. Once they are given once, they remain issued forever. Although, on certain conditions, the company can buy those shares back. Shares that are bought back are called treasury shares, and outstanding shares are those that remain in the hands of shareholders. So authorized, this is important, authorized is not part of your percentage calculation. The company has 1 million shares and has issued 100, and you have 50 of those shares. What percent of the company do you own? The company has authorized 1 million shares, and it has issued 100. You have 50 of those shares. What percent of the company do you own? 50%. 50%, not 50 over 1 million, right? There's only 100 issued and outstanding shares. You have 50 of those shares. So you have a lot of control over that company, but not for long, because that company, if that company goes ahead and issues the remainder of its authorized shares, you've gone from having 50% to having whatever 50 over a million is. Not much. Not much. And only the outstanding shares can vote. Some shares are issued and outstanding, but remember, what's the difference between issued and outstanding? Issued means it was given once, but if it was repurchased by the company, it's not outstanding anymore, it's treasury. So we can also think of it that treasury plus outstanding equals issued, because they're going to be in one of those two places. And treasury shares don't vote. Only outstanding shares vote. All right, so that was a lot of information I just crammed into the session here. Oh, question?
Okay, so going back to your 100 shares, you say you know you only issue, or sorry, authorized, no, a million authorized, issue 100. What happens when you buy them back? Do they just go back into the authorized pool?
Oh, if they get repurchased, they go into the treasury.
So no one really owns that.
The corporation owns that.
So it could, in theory, own itself one day if they bought it.
Yes, they could buy back all, yes, the corporation could theoretically buy back all their shares. We'll see a case on this. The shares don't vote, though. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know of any case where the corporation actually bought back all of its shares. So I don't know who then would have any authority to vote. You'd have sort of a perpetual board at that point. It would be, I don't know. I don't know if that's, but theoretically that could happen. A corporation could repurchase all of its shares. Yeah.
I had a stock in Apple a few years ago, and they split their shares.
Uh-huh.
What's the difference between,
Just math. Splitting is just math. So there's stock splits, there's forward stock splits, and reverse stock splits. So you end up with more shares at the end, right?
Right.
Double the amount of shares. So what you saw right now.
authorize more shares?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's-
So what happened was the authorized shares went from 1 million to 2 million. The issued shares went from, 8,000 to 16,000. Everything doubled, right down the line. And in the end of the day, did your percentage change? Not at all. You had the same value, the same percentage. It just, some people, some companies, what is the famous company that has never split its shares? Public company, the shares are like $100,000.
Is it Berkshire?
Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway has never split its shares. As a result, it's considered unaffordable. Some people say it's a bargain. Let's take a look at what that is. Yeah, a share of Berkshire Hathaway today is $319,000. Yeah, wow, but so what? I mean, you could have one share of Berkshire Hathaway, or you could have, oh man, this is a little hard, but okay, you could have a lot of shares of Papa John's. I didn't think, okay, I was hoping for like more of like a round number, like 100 or something. Yeah, or Nike, you know. So essentially, these companies can split their shares. You have more shares that are worth half as much if there's a 2-to-1 split. You have the same percentage of the company, same total market cap. It's just math. It's sound and fury signifying nothing. Except some people care. I mean, some people like the idea of having more shares. And when a company's stock price gets too high, there's pressure for it to split. I don't know what too high means and why people care about that sort of thing, because usually these things are purchased in mutual funds, but people like their shares to be around $100. People have weird numbers they like. Jim.
So what exactly is there to stop the company from just issuing more shares and diluting their ownership?
The only limit would be how many are authorized. The board can issue as many shares as are authorized, but as I pointed out here, you know, the authorized number is in that charter, and the shareholders have to approve an increase to that number.
And you are the shareholder.
Well, if you own the share, yeah, if you own the shares, you're a shareholder. You can vote, and you have the right to not vote for a charter amendment. And so, if you get involved in a company that looks like this, that has 1 million authorized shares and only 8,000 outstanding, you know you're going to be diluted. So when you do a venture capital deal and you sell Series A for $5 million to some investors, What you're going to do is, in the process, you're going to amend the charter, so after you sell those shares, there are no more authorized shares. That will force you to go back to that investor and say, please, 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 can I issue more shares? And they'll say, fine, if you give me the first crack at it, or however they want to negotiate. But yeah, it's generally good practice as a corporate attorney not to leave authorized shares unissued unless you have a purpose for them, because then they can be used for dilution. Joe.
If a corporation did buy back all of their shares, their treasury shares, wouldn't it effectively just be a company going private?
No, because it wouldn't be held by anyone, not a private person, not another person. And there's something, I'm missing something here. I haven't thought about, it's an interesting question. There's a concept of zero-member LLCs also that Sean Barron at University of Florida has written about. It's a very theoretical point. I don't have a clear answer about how it would function. There's probably some limitation to it to being implemented in practice. It also, it would make no financial sense. Like, no one would want that, because then you'd abandon all opportunity to vote and change the direction of the company. The company would be in sort of a perpetual course toward wherever it was going, which should drive the value down badly. And I don't know why a corporation would choose to do that. It just, either they're wasting their assets to pay the shareholders. Something would be weird about that. Yeah.
Well, wouldn't a corporation going private the first step in buying back all the outstanding stock?
The corporation doesn't buy it. No, someone will buy it. A person. A person. Michael Dell is very wealthy, and he bought the shares of Dell.
Well, I have Boston Celtics stock, and they're not a privately traded company anymore, and they bought back all the stock when they were going private.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't be the Boston Celtics as the company. It would have been someone in the Boston Celtics who wanted to take it private. Someone actually bought, a entity or a person bought those shares from you. They either did it through a tender offer that you accepted, or a second step squeeze-out merger if they were a Delaware corporation.
I just got a check in the mail with the paper saying I don't own stock anymore.
Yeah, so you probably were part of that second step top-off merger. Yeah, which is something they can do as a statutory provision under Delaware law. So you were squeezed out, as they say, but they had to give you a certain price, which is usually going to be at least a 50% premium over the market price, something called a control premium. But yeah, a person bought those shares from you, or an entity, right? And so in the case of Dell, it was Michael Dell. In the case of Tesla, it would be Elon Musk, who's going to use his private wealth to buy those shares. He's going to make offers to people. Hey, the stock price is currently 79.92. I'll pay you 100. And if he gets enough people to take that deal, 90% of the outstanding shareholders become his, at which point he's able to execute a second step merger. We don't talk about M&A in this class, so I'll leave that for future classes. All right, so I want to show you a couple things about corporations that are going to pertain. So I want to start by this video with Papa John's just to get some background, and then we only have a little bit of time for discussion, so I want to get your thoughts on this.
The face of Papa John's Pizza is changing. This is after the company's founder admitted using the N-word during a conference call. John Schnatter's name and face have been scrubbed now from the company website and the marketing materials. He also resigned as chairman of the board. And the University of Louisville is even removing the Papa John's name from its football stadium. Here's part of an open letter the CEO posted to the Papa John's website yesterday. Racism and any insensitive language, no matter what the context, simply cannot and will not be tolerated at any level of our company. The board of directors of Papa John's accepted Mr. Schnatter's resignation as chairman of the board earlier this week. Now, it has also been decided that he will no longer be in any of the advertising or marketing materials associated with the brand. Paulo Sandoval is joining us now to discuss this. John Schnatter is Papa John's. What is he saying?
Yes, no, Papa John's is without its John because of what we've seen there, what you just read a little while ago, and how they're having to restructure some of their marketing. And what he's saying at this point is that there is more to the story, but when it all comes down to it, yes, he did use the N-word, and yes, he is sorry. He has given several interviews to several media outlets in the Louisville area, explaining that all of this had to do, with, or at least his use of the N-word was during what he called a training session over the phone between various Papa John's executives and also a marketing company. This is how he's explained it in some of these interviews, exactly how and why this went down.
It wasn't a slur. It was a session on strategy and media planning and training and I repeated something that somebody else said, and said we're not going to say that. We don't use that kind of language and vocabulary. And sure, it got taken out of context, and sure, it got twisted, but that doesn't matter. I hurt people's feelings. That's what matters here. And for that, I'm sorry. I'm disappointed in myself that something like that could happen.
The so-called strategy session here is leading to some corporate fallout. There have been many big clients that have been, many partners that have been pulling out of their deals with Papa John's, the New York Yankees, for example, also the Atlanta Falcons, and also another professional team in Atlanta, Atlanta United, the soccer team. They're also severing ties with Papa John's. And this, of course, goes in addition to all of the internal turmoil that this has caused in the pizza giant here. Papa John's, the CEO, as you said a little while ago, now removing this man from all of their advertisements. However, we should mention that he is still a massive shareholder in this. However, he will not be the face of the company anymore.
Oh, jeez. Thanks, YouTube. So, this is Papa John's. All right, and so when did this episode begin? Pretty recently, but this is what they've been looking at in terms of their stock. All right, so we can look at that from the year perspective, from the 6 month, from the 1 month. It's actually up in the 1 month. It's actually up right now. And I think this news hit, wasn't it first on August 8th, right? So that sort of looks like that caused a little dip here. Well, I shouldn't say caused. I should say correlated. Causation is very hard to prove. Correlation, I can suggest pretty easily. But, if you look out the 6 months, it was definitely a low point here, but this is where they were before. This is where they are now. So that's just some sort of facts about how to read this chart. Beyond charts, though, kind of thoughts about this story, reactions to what happened. Is it the responsibility of a pizza company to be sensitive with its language? Why? Why not? Why did the partners pull out? What happened here? Yeah, Joe.
They're worried about backlash from people who would be offended by the use of that word. I think it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, there clearly is a backlash for people who are upset about the use of the N-word in any context. I mean, it's just, it's sort of, he admitted, but, what about the fact he admitted he was wrong? I mean, this is, I want to try to paint both sides. I was hoping there'd be more discussion. This is not my perspectives, but the devil's advocate here is here's a person who spent his life building this company. He used a word in a training session once. Does that justify these actions to this extent? Yeah.
But doesn't this also build on, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but didn't like a year ago Papa John's become correlated with Nazis as the official pizza Nazis? I mean, they obviously tried to distance themselves from that, but I know the sort of white supremacist movement was related to Papa John's in some way.
Yeah, so that's more part of the story here. Now, it's not a great situation if Googling your name and neo-Nazi results in this many hits on Google. I think you can basically rest assured you've done something wrong in the PR department. But he does have this history. This was, by the way, November 2014. Now, I mean, I'm not sure how much we should care about this or not. I mean, this is an open question, but it makes sense at least to look at what is actually happening with the stock during these periods of time. So let's go back and look at what happened there in November, right? This again, see that low point there? November 7th, that we saw that on the article. So he's over there having battles. Neo-Nazis are calling Papa John's the official pizza. He's flipping them off. Did seem to recover though. But yeah, there was a flap about that. And I think it had to do with his opposition to the protest, was tied to the Nike story. So there is more backstory to it. So maybe it wasn't just one word once, but something more systemic where he's creating either culture, right, a tone from the top, right, some kind of problem there. Tyler.
Yeah, it just kind of fell apart. It seems like that he came out when Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee and said you should stand for the national anthem, and then that turned into neo-Nazis supporting him, and a lot more people than just Nazis and neo-Nazis were supporting Papa John and making that stand. But that's a super hot button issue, which I guess this company kind of try to avoid, and
Yeah, I mean, you gotta be like, John, shut your mouth. Like, that's not a good thing to say. Like, why would you say that? On the other hand, he's a private citizen. Does he have the right to say what he said? Is he a private citizen? Does he have additional obligations to society because of his role as pizza man, pizza king?
I mean, I think part of the problem is his image, his identity is so intertwined with that brand. And I didn't know this, but apparently he has like a sort of fangirl following wherever this was founded at.
Oh.
Is what I've been told. So when he says things like that, it's not just him giving his opinion. Like, it was his face on the brand.
He represents something. He is the face of the brand. When you're the face of the brand, you can't say I'm just a private citizen. Your name is on 50 million pizza boxes. Your face is on those pizza boxes, right? He is, in a way, if you are willing to be literally the icon for the company. Everyone know what the image looks like? Sorry, oh, that's actually kind of... Right? I mean, this guy is more than a private citizen right here, right? He stands for something. Stands for better ingredients, better pizza. And maybe for anti-national anthem protests. Was that appropriate? Yeah, John?
I think he made a strategic decision because their sales were down, right? And he attributed it to the decrease in the NFL viewership and less people going to games. And he tried to blame the stock performance, I think, on that, and then everything just kind of snowballed because of the issues that are wrapped in.
Yeah, so what if he took a stand against taking a knee in order to make a point, in order to generate sales? I mean, some say that any news is good news. I mean, let's keep that in mind. Let's just shift gears for a minute. Look at a company that really took a different direction. This is a
Nike is defending its controversial new ad campaign after backlash from President Trump and other critics. In an interview, the president said Nike is sending a terrible message, he says, by partnering with unsigned NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. But he added their freedom to do so is what this country is all about. Kaepernick triggered the NFL player protests against social injustice back in 2016 by kneeling during the national anthem. CBS This Morning Saturday co-host, that's Dana Jacobson, joins us at the table. She's been following the Nike controversy from the beginning. Dana, good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, this is not going away, and the season hasn't even started yet. An NFL executive, at least one, has expressed support for Kaepernick, saying in part the social justice issues that Colin and other professional athletes have raised deserve our attention and action. But Nike's decision is also fanning the flames on social media. Nike's controversial endorsement of Colin Kaepernick is reigniting the debate over NFL players taking a knee during the national anthem. Some critics are destroying their Nike-branded gear. Others are praising the iconic company. Super Bowl champion Chris Long.
Kids looking at that and saying, if I take a risk like Colin and speak my mind and tell the truth, am I going to be kind of shut out from the mainstream? And Nike's doing a good job of reinforcing that that's not true.
Kaepernick is one of at least 5 other athletes, including New York Giants receiver Odell Beckham Jr. and tennis star Serena Williams, who are featured in the 30th anniversary of Nike's Just Do It campaign. Williams praised Kaepernick after her U.S. Open match last night.
He's done a lot for, the African American community, and it's cost him a lot.
A Nike spokesperson tells CBS This Morning the athletes featured in their new campaign all share the quality of being among the most inspirational athletes of their generation, who have leveraged the power of sport to help move the world forward.
It is a pretty big risk on their part.
E.J. Schultz covers sports marketing for Ad Age. He says although companies like Starbucks and Pepsi have been criticized for botched ads surrounding social issues, Nike's new campaign may be different.
I think they've calculated that some of the key consumers that they're trying to win over, younger people that buy a lot of Nike gear, are siding with Colin Kaepernick.
Nike lost about $3.75 billion in market cap at the end of trading on Tuesday. Important to point out, some analysts also attributed that to negotiations over NAFTA. Despite the loss, one estimate reportedly says Nike has earned at least $43 million worth of media exposure following the Kaepernick ad. You can't pay for that.
Yeah, an important point about courting younger.
Yes.
Younger people are out there looking towards that. It's like they know their audience.
Exactly.
Know their audience.
Calculated risk. Calculated risk.
Thank you.
So, from a financial standpoint, purely from a financial standpoint, Nike's decision to support Colin Kaepernick lost more money in terms of net dollars, nearly $4 billion of value wiped out. This is value to shareholders going away and not coming back. I'm not saying that's what's most important, but just to point out, this is that effect. It's a more significant effect in terms of dollars than anything the Papa John's CEO has done through this process. Now, that doesn't make one thing right or one thing wrong, but how does that play into it in terms of liabilities for corporations? Yeah, Sam.
This is just an educated guess, but the things that happened with Papa John's were unexpected and obviously and part of a downward trend. These seem more like calculated risks and calculated losses that may end up positive in the long run. And at least from the last graph you were showing, were part of a long-term positive trend.
Although a long-term positive trend that just took a big dip, right? In fairness, yeah.
I read something this morning about Nike saying that a big part of their loss was due to something I forget now.
Yeah, they claimed there was a spurious. They claimed that it was because of Trump's trade war, right? "Quote unquote," right? Trump's trade war, and that's hard to say that is as strong as. We have a very strong correlation here in time, so it looks like it was caused by that. Of course, it was. The other thing to think about here, and I'll just leave you with this thought, is that the investors in this company are different from the consumers in this company. Who buys Nike shoes and who buys Nike stocks? Different people. Different people. Does this reflect people disliking Nike brand? No. This represents investors thinking that the value of Nike brand will go down or simply reacting to the news. Now, we'll talk more about this as the semester goes on, but just realize that while these things feel and are fundamentally very different, on paper, financially, they're very similar, and shareholders can sue Nike and may sue Nike for this. Think about whether or not that's justifiable to sue Nike. In addition to whether it's justifiable, if you say that Nike should not be sued for this, then you might also say Papa John should not be sued. How do you distinguish one from the other? You might, of course, say both could be sued, both should lose, right? Now, different choice entirely if you decide not to invest in this company. You decide it's not socially responsible to invest in Papa John's. You make an activist choice and sell your shares in Nike. But from a corporate law perspective, hard to distinguish between the effect financially on shareholders on these two things. Morally, however, I think it feels really different. Things for us to think about for next week. So, see you in a week.